Quick recap. Last week we talked about genre, had a lot of good times. One thing that I forgot to mention, and this was supposed to be my piece de resistance when I was talking about the relationship between blaxploitation cinema and kung fu. I was supposed to talk about Power Man and Iron Fist, the Marvel comic, and Luke Cage being one of the first black characters represented in Marvel, and was clearly a representation of the blaxploitation caricature. Him being the African-American representation of the black identity, and Black Panther being the Pan-African representation of blackness. But it would have been nice if I threw that in the lecture last week. Anyways, welcome back. Today we're focusing in on, we're going to focus in on action, specifically action adventure. There's no clear definition about this genre. We all kind of know what it is, but we just haven't really locked it in. But I have done plenty of reading, have done plenty of research, and I have come up with a definition that I feel really encapsulates what action adventure does, and it's very functional. So as you approach your stories, this is a possible way of structuring it that can really make it quick and effective, and you can get all of that information in there in a really short period of time. Let's begin with that definition. I have it written. A story in which an adventurer faces conflicts that result in a set piece until the narrative is concluded. It may not necessarily be one set piece, it could be several set pieces. That has everything that I think you need to know if you're that understood that. Well, I guess since I wrote a whole lecture about it, we could just kind of just break down what that paragraph, that long sentence meant. These classic narratives of adventure kind of go back a long ways. You could tell that a lot of it has this kind of messianic hero figure, the one person who goes on this massive epic to accomplish great deeds. That could be tracked down to, if you wanted to, Bible stories. Or even you could go to Homer's The Odyssey. As you kind of move forward, you get to see that this structure starts to take on more classic tropes as it moves forward. You get things like Moby Dick, or you get something like Treasure Island, which also kind of has this hero's journey, but it's in a bit more of a concise structure. It's not as long as The Odyssey or as the Bible. And you get these really concise stories that are really about the internal struggles of folks growing. But honestly, Moby Dick is 480 pages, and it is something that you have to pick up a massive book and read. And at some point, especially when literacy wasn't as common as it is today, you look for ways of finding more marketable options. Now, we could immediately jump to long form comics and magazines and pulps and all that stuff. But before all of that, you had a lot of short stories that would show up in long form magazines. This still is very present. You find some short stories in different publications. But back then, having these serialized narratives pop up, people put out a chapter issue or every other issue of a magazine. And so you could have something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was serialized in 1869 in a periodical magazine titled, I have it written down right here, Magasin d'éducation et de récréation by Pierre Jules Hetzel. Now, I don't speak French, but I believe that's as close as I'm going to be able to get. But they started serializing these narratives, breaking them down, and so they were more digestible, more accessible. Even as you look at action today, rather it be in books or films or comics, you realize that palatability and accessibility ends up being very definitive in this genre. It's not so much like a lot of dramas, what people would classify as high art, serious works. Unfortunately, action was quickly relegated into entertainment. And entertainment, marketing is king. Accessibility is king. And so we're going to talk about some structures that focus in on that accessibility and that sellability. Now, this is the part where I have to confess to you, I haven't made a great habit of reading a lot of modern action adventure or action novels. Pros. I've read plenty of comics. I've watched plenty of films. But as far as the books, I simply have only one reference. Transitioning from a lot of that classical literature to more serialized classics, we get into the dirty, the pulps. Now, some of you may be familiar with pulp through the film by Quentin Tarantino, Pulp Fiction. It was just a clever name about the type of content that was released. But Pulp Fiction was a serialized version of these action novels where they could be collected and made into these larger stories, but they were the cheapest kind of low-end type of stories one can find. They were just basically being pumped out as quickly as possible, and they were really fun. Like, I am a Pulp Fiction fan. I used to just read tons of it. As you can see right here, I'm repping really hard. This is from a bookstore in San Francisco, KO Books, and they used to sell nothing but pulp novels. And I used to go there and buy like a little pulp magazine for like, $3, and it was a really good time. Just to give you a sense of the type of things that they would have in that space, this is the type of genre sections they would have if you went upstairs or toward the back. By the way, these are not real sections because I cannot actually find the names of the real sections. The bookstore closed down in, I think, 2009 or 2010. But this is the kind of stuff you would find. Lesbian werewolf romance, surfer gang adventures, celebrity parody murder mysteries, horror. And, they had some regular sections in there too, But, it was a place that kind of had access to a bunch of different things. I even brought a couple examples. And so you had something like 31st of February, The Ships from Outside. And then, boom, double feature, Beyond the Galactic Rim, Fish or Cut Bait. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is so that you understand the function of the pulps and the type of stories that came out of the space. At the same time that you had a lot of really important literary fiction coming out, like J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, you had The Great Gatsby, all of these things, important novels, they're so important. For the most part, one of the big sells at that time was going to be Pulp Fiction. The story that I want to focus on, and I've only read one, but this is a long series that kind of became the precursor for a lot of comic book tropes. A bronze man named Doc Savage. Now, Doc Savage had super strength, was super smart, and Doc Savage is going to be the best representation of the adventurer. As I mentioned in the statement, you could look at two different major themes in action adventure. One being the presence of the protagonist as the adventurer, and the other being the set pieces present in those narratives. And so, see, we got there. All right. Oh, sorry for that rough transition. We've been having some technical difficulties on my side, and I apologize. Where was I? Doc Savage, yes. So Doc Savage embodied the archetypal notion of an adventurer. I believe I'd mentioned that he had these just kind of extreme abilities. I wrote them down so that I didn't miss any. So first off, we're going to acknowledge his title, Dr. Savage, because he's a physician and scientist. But not just that, he's also a detective, like a world-renowned detective. Has a very Sherlock Holmes vibe on top of it. A polymath, which I'll throw up a definition, but means you're good at everything. And he is a professional adventurer, there to fight wrongs and protect the innocent and do what adventurers and heroes do. This became a really effective way of making a quick story that was serialized. You approach a narrative at this point because you would have characters like the Shadow, and this would turn into Superman, this would turn into Batman, this would turn into Uncle Scrooge. This would bleed into a lot of narratives that would be definitively action-adventure because they set up the notion that if your character in the beginning of the story is smart, wealthy, and strong, physically advantageous in some way, has trained, their profession reflects their skill set, then all you have to do is identify their profession at the beginning, and then any actions that require excellence can easily be written off as a part of their inherent skill set. This person is a kung fu master scientist. And so when they have to defuse a bomb and then fight Nazis, that makes total sense because that was established in their skill set. And you'll see that as a way of creating quick serials where anybody could pick up a story at any point in time and you are on an adventure with this character. But you know that this is not the first adventure, and this surely will not be their last adventure. And the writer doesn't have to concern themselves with making their adventures believable, because presumably this is just another Tuesday for Doc Savage. This is just another Wednesday for Batman. This is just another Saturday or Sunday, usually a weekend adventure for Uncle Scrooge and Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So you would get these narratives that were had a precursor, and though this was very important in terms of making serialized content, as mentioned before, later on in films, that character existed. This is a character, they're a spy, they're going on a spy tale, and their skill set's amazing. Iron Man is a wealthy tech genius, and so obviously you don't need to explain why he's going around and fighting crime with his robot suit, because obviously that's what you do when you're a tech genius. Superman has superpowers and he's an alien, and of course he's gonna fight crime. There are these just quick shortcuts in language that, especially once this was established as a trope, immediately a reader could jump onto. Which, and just for clarification, when I use words like tropes or cliches, I'm just saying these are shorthands for your reader. If you look at a New Yorker cartoon and they have a desert island, they don't necessarily have to establish why a person is on that desert island. This is a New Yorker cartoon. Of course, a person's on a desert island. So these are precursors and assumptions that a reader makes because these things have been used so much that it already has meaning associated with it. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the adventurer. And so a lot of the things about that identity are precursors to a narrative, shortcuts, shorthands, so that your reader could quickly understand what you're doing. Which also brings me to this second thing. This isn't always present in the adventurer narratives, but you will often see this, especially in classic ones, which is the sidekick, the witness. Usually adventurers will have someone present there to be amazed by how amazing they are. When you look at DuckTales, well, that's the cartoon. The Adventures of Uncle Scrooge. He has Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and at times Donald Duck there, to be amazed by the fact that he's flying on a plane across the country into East Asia to solve a mystery. And everyone who's joining him is like, wow, Uncle Scrooge, you're amazing. You're doing all of this amazing stuff. You get that with Batman and Robin. Robin's there to be like, wow, Batman, you're amazing. You're doing all these amazing things. And that might be something that's really worthwhile playing with, is a sidekick to carry a lot of the weight of the exposition for your reader. The sidekick embodies the tag-along character that is the reader, that forces the main character to explain things that they clearly don't understand. It allows for a vehicle for quick exposition, and again, when you're using these tropes, the reader catches on really quickly because they've seen this trope used over and over again. Now that we got the adventurer kind of like really locked in terms of what the function of that role of adventurer is, and we've even touched in on the sidekicks and the wards of the adventurer, I want to move into that second part of that explanation, which is the set piece. A set piece is an aesthetic event. If you were to create a car chase, if you were to create a shootout, if you were to arrange a fight, this is where it would be. It would be the set piece. Interesting thing about a set piece is that it is in many ways why a reader or a viewer is present for this genre. The action adventure is a lot like the musical. So you have these stories, you have these plots, you need those stories, you need those plots. But what distinguishes a musical as a genre piece is the fact that 50% of that musical is sung. Song? It's sung. It's music, And so when you're looking at an action adventure, the set piece is an event that a reader will not likely find in their day-to-day lives. It could either be some type of choreographed fight, intense action, what have you. My favorite one when I see these things is usually a Jack Kirby comic page, because he would really build toward these massive battles between large groups of people. I mean, even the one-on-ones were really intense, and there are really interesting approaches to creating those scenes and making them super effective. If it was leaning more toward a science fiction narrative, there could be something that's visually an explosion of color and lights and all of these kind of different visual elements. And so if you were thinking about your narrative in the story that has a massive device fly into the side of a building, and then everyone just has to jump out and they like land on a shorter building and put out a fire, that would be your set piece. And you could build a story around that set piece. This is, of course, specifically in reference to a 7 to 10 page comic. But if you wanted to do a long form story that was action adventure, you might want to break it down to, if you were doing issues or chapters, 3 set pieces per issue. And so you would create a plot surrounding those set pieces. Infamously, Hellboy, written by Mike Mignola, is about the set pieces. Mike Mignola actively said he wanted to make artwork that weren't in cities. He didn't want to have to do cars. He didn't want to have to do large casts of folks. He wanted to do a lot of monsters. He created a story where he could do monsters in caves and ancient spaces fighting. He enjoyed illustrating monuments and artifacts, and he enjoyed doing and he kind of wrote around these set pieces, these fights, and he created these narratives. Now, by all means, not slacking on the narrative at all, but he did define the set pieces as what he wants to do. That's actually a great example of an action-adventure narrative that has this symbolic framework of horror. So there's some horror visual elements, but it is clearly this action-adventure comic. And so consider the set pieces as being one of the main reasons why someone is coming to an action adventure. And so you have a basic plot that allows for the reader to get to these set pieces. And then there's an expectation of some type of wrap-up, a button, kind of sort of clever end. It doesn't have to be crazy clever, doesn't have to be crazy smart, but some type of a resolve. So you have this formula for a fairly easy narrative where you kind of fill in the spaces, and it's not too tight to where it limits creativity, because you can still do a massive amount of things within that structure, within that framework. But what those tropes and cliches do, it allows for you to do more in the less amount of time. So you could always go back and expand a narrative from a short story that has these really quintessential points. But you have this premise, this adventurer, the adventurer has a job, and that adventurer is there for a reason. The last thing I wanted to touch on was the relationship between action-adventure and broader notions of action. In comics specifically, around the time that action-adventure was really catching on, around the time superheroes were catching on, other popular actions were war stories and westerns. Unlike these kind of action-adventure narratives with these adventurers going out and seeking adventure, you had these war comics and these westerns, which were more these survivalist narratives about folks who actually were living in environments that allowed for a little bit more gray areas. Though at that time, especially considering all the comics that were coming out were World War II comics, the villain was still very much the bad guy. In westerns, the bad guy was still very much the bad guy. But the ambiguity lied in the less righteous steps that one would have to take to do the right thing. While Batman or Superman can have never kill policies, for an American soldier to go off and fight Nazis and to have not kill policies would be not just unrealistic, but in many ways would be perceived as disrespectful to the military personnel who were fighting in those wars. And when they were first coming out, reading those comics, a lot of those comics came in care packages. And so these spaces allowed for a little more nuance, and you might want to explore that. But do understand that those environments and the fact that it's a Western, the fact that it is a war narrative, comes with its own assumptions about the characters involved in those stories and the spaces that they live in. That's why you could have Western as a genre. But I felt like the action adventure one, because of its lack of nuance, because of its lack of realism, allows for a little bit more room to play, and it's a little bit more forgivable in terms of short stories, especially if you don't have that experience. Another thing to note is that after World War II, a lot of people who were making those comics, they were in the war. Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, all those folks fought in the army, and so that medium often reflected that reality. Now, which brings us to our conclusion. What's important this week is that this is the first week where I have a required reading, and I've thrown on a recommended reading in there as well, because this thing, honestly, the recommended reading is money. It's Stephen King. I've picked my favorite chapter out of that book. I recommend that you go and check out that full book. I found it to be immensely inspiring when it comes to actually sitting down and writing and understanding the amount of work and the skill sets needed to create a large body of work, especially if you are looking to do like writing comics as your primary career focus. But as far as focusing on action adventure, we are looking at Danger and Adventure Comics, a Charlton comic. In it, there's a short story called Nyoka, the Jungle Girl. So that's not nearly as racist as it sounds. It is actually about a woman who you don't necessarily know her background, but people call her the Jungle Girl, and she seems to know a lot about the jungle and navigating and whatnot. She's a jungle girl. That's all we need to know. And she is protecting gorillas in the wild. So that's a fun, positive narrative. I had to read a few to find the least racist, sexist ones. I can't promise you that I'll be successful every week, but check this out. And on Thursday, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this step by step and kind of break down some of the notions that are gone over in this, and have that as a part of my lecture. And we'll really kind of disseminate how one approaches giving all of the one thing functioning within the genre with the adventurer, looking at the set pieces in it, and also looking at how they incorporate the plot and the villains and the characters in seamlessly, while allowing us to focus in on the adventurer and those set pieces. So check out all those readings, and I will see you all on Thursday.